All right, so we're going to take a look at a couple of documents associated with the ratification of the Constitution. The Federalist Papers were a series of essays written by three people mostly, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. And they were about defending the Constitution and kind of trying to convince people to ratify the Constitution. The Anti-Federalists, which this first document here is from, is Anti-Federalist number 1, which was the Anti-Federalists were people that were opposed to the Constitution. They didn't like the Constitution for a number of reasons. Kind of the biggest and most important reason was that they wanted to have individual rights protected because they feared having a national government that was too strong. And they were really kind of scarred by what Britain had done to the colonists. So they didn't want to repeat that situation again. So they wanted individual rights protected. So these were written actually in response to the Federalist Papers, which we'll get to in a moment. But let's take a look at the language of this Anti-Federalist number 1. So he's taught Brutus, and by the way, that's not the person's real name here, but they are signing these using like Roman names. So here Brutus is saying that the government under the Constitution is going to have absolute power, and that's something that they're very much afraid of. And he names the 3 branches here. And they're saying it's a more powerful government than the old Articles of Confederation, right? So this is a new kind of government which is much more powerful than the Articles of Confederation. And this is a little scary to them. And he says down here that these laws are going to affect every person, right? And so that individuals are going to need protection from the government. So that it's saying that it should be framed to secure the freedom of citizens, right? So that everybody needs protection from the power of the government. So they're basically talking about adding in a Bill of Rights so that the government wouldn't be able to take too much power from individuals or act as a tyrant as they felt like the British government did. So that's the Anti-Federalist argument is if we're going to have this government, and it's going to be powerful like it is, we need to make sure that individuals' freedom is protected. Okay, which then brings us to the Federalist Papers. So the Federalist Papers, as I mentioned, there are a series of essays. James Madison is one of the authors. Hamilton is another one. So if we're looking at the source, we're going to look at the sourcing information, and it says James Madison. So what do we know about him? It's definitely a name we should recognize. He's known as the father of the Constitution because he kind of took a lot of notes at the Constitutional Convention. He kind of was studying different forms of government and kind of came up with the 3 branches idea, which he borrowed from Montesquieu and the Enlightenment. And we see the Federalist here. This is the Federalist Papers. So we're talking about people that supported the Constitution. And this is number 51. So there's 2 Federalist Papers that are important, the Federalist 51 and Federalist 10. We're going to talk here about Federalist 51 in particular. So in this one, James Madison, who supported the Constitution, because of his nickname, Father of the Constitution, right? So he supports the Constitution. Here he's talking about the idea of power in the government and why the Constitution, even though the federal government is more powerful than under the Articles, why it's okay to be that way. And he says here, ambition must be made to counteract ambition. Essentially what he's saying is talking about the checks and balances, that the powers in each, the separation of powers, use the powers in each branch to limit the others. So ambition, that's like power, must be made to counteract power. So that's the checks and balances. And he says that human nature means that we have to have things to control the abuse of power. So checks and balances are a necessary fact because human beings are, human. They make mistakes and they try and get more power. They can act as tyrants. So if they build in checks and balances, then that won't happen. And he says here, too, that when you're starting a government, you first want the government to be able to control the governed. That's kind of the idea of the government is there to make sure that people's natural rights are protected. But he says, the next place, the second most important thing to do is to control the government itself, right? To basically stop tyranny from happening, to avoid tyranny. So the Federalist Papers, Madison is arguing that the government under the Constitution has some safeguards to protect against having a too powerful government. So having checks and balances here is a way to control the government itself. So between the Federalist Papers here and the Anti-Federalist Papers, these are a debate that was happening over the ratification of the Constitution. And eventually, a Bill of Rights is added, and the Constitution is ratified with a large degree of help from the Federalist Papers that Madison, Hamilton, and Jay wrote. Okay, so that's the debate between Federalists and Anti-Federalists over the Constitution.